Hello everyone, and welcome back to Zile Tales. Today we delve into a chilling true crime case that shook Kenya to its core. Viewer discretion is advised as we discuss the life and crimes of Philip Onyancha. Remember, our goal is to shed light on the impact of such events and emphasize the importance of awareness and community safety. Background and early life. Philip Onyancha, born in 1978, went from an unassuming background to becoming one of Kenya's most notorious criminals. Growing up in Western Kenya, his early life seemed ordinary, but as we explore, it's crucial to understand the factors that may have contributed to his later actions. Philip claims that in his youth, he was molested by a worker at his family's home. This happened a handful of times and left Philip traumatized. He also says that it damaged his psyche, making him believe that he could get anything that he wanted if he used force. Some of Philip's more troubled behaviors began to present themselves in Philip's second year of high school. Gone was the Philip of Form 1, who showed a lot of initiative and tried to prove himself to the older children. Entering his second year, he seemed to let his age get to his head incredibly early and seemingly began to take it out on his vulnerable classmates. Onesmus Mwangi, a math teacher at Kenyatta Mahiga that also served as school's deputy head teacher, later recalled Philip's behavioral shift. When he arrived here, he was a very dedicated student who led his class for several terms, but when he got to Form 2, he appears to have lost his marbles after he was suspended for bullying Form 1 students. It would later be learned that Philip wasn't just being accused of bullying, rather he had been accused by a Form 1 student, a younger boy, of sodomy. It is also worth noting that throughout this time period, as Philip began to come to the end of his secondary education, the school itself was receiving whispers of some kind of devil worship. Every school has its own fair share of random gossip, but the rumors seem much more malicious in retrospect when it involves the occult. Former students and school officials would remark on this years later, but at the time they had nothing tying these rumors back to Philip. To them, he was just a disgruntled kid eagerly awaiting graduation. Philip sat for his KCSE in 1998, the Kenyan equivalent of the high school diploma. He ended up graduating with a GPA equivalent of a C-, but never collected the certificate, instead choosing to roll the dice by retaking the test sometime later. Philip went to another school for his fourth year, Form 4, and earned his KCSE there. However, instead of continuing with his education at college or university, he instead decided to enter the workforce, eventually becoming a security guard. He lived in the village near his family's farm in Western Kenya, but eventually moved back to Nyeri, the same city where he had gone to secondary school years earlier. It would later be learned that Philip was forced out of his family village when he was accused of attempting to rape a neighbor, and he moved back to the only other region he was familiar with. Philip says that this wasn't true, however. He claims to have made the move to Nyeri nearly 300 kilometers away because he was hearing voices that he had been hearing since high school, who had been growing in volume and intensity, and were encouraging him to make rash decisions, including the decision to kill. Over the next decade or so, following the conclusion of his secondary education in the late 1990s, Philip Onyancha entered the workforce. He worked primarily as a security guard who was employed by G4S, a global security firm. As such, Philip was often moved around and began to work as a guard at various companies as well as private residences. He was eventually married to a young woman named Lydia Nyamboke in the mid-2000s. Following his move to Nyeri, the two married and moved to Nairobi, where they lived in a small one-bedroom house, along with a brother-in-law, a sister-in-law, and 2 children. One of the children was Philip and Lydia's, a son that was born in the year 2008. When the child was still an infant, Philip's wife Lydia began to grow suspicious of his odd behavior. She had always known him as a kind and compassionate man, but he began to spend odd hours out and about, in particular staying out unusually late and hanging out with unknown acquaintances. Eventually, in June of 2009, she even called him out on this, later telling reporters, "I thought he had another wife," and even asked him to let me go if this was the case. However, despite her fears, she stuck with Philip, who insisted that nothing was wrong. He said he remained committed to Lydia and their infant son, and he continued providing for their young family. Outside his home, Philip struck neighbors and acquaintances as a seemingly normal guy who randomly did strange things. Neighbors say that they barely spoke to Philip, if at all, but if they did, he seemed odd. He would say weird things and lash out in certain ways, like turning off the main power breaker to the entire neighborhood. When neighbors complained about this type of erratic behavior, he responded by threatening to hire someone to kill them. When he did more usual annoying neighbor stuff, such as playing his music loudly late at night, nobody complained or questioned him. because they were afraid of some kind of reprisal. Modus operandi. Onyancha claimed to have a special ability, a magic touch, and was able to lure women away to private locations, leading to the brutal murders of 17 innocent women. The spree left communities in fear and raised questions about the vulnerabilities within society that criminals like Onyancha exploit. When a killer strikes, they usually lash out close to home. Most investigators start the investigation inside the family and work their way out. Occasionally, though, it becomes apparent that these crimes are not done by anyone with a personal motive. These are people driven by something within, and they usually attack those who can't fight back. In June 2009, at the same time that Philip Onyancha's wife began to suspect something was going on in his life that she didn't know about, a boy in Nairobi went missing. The boy, named Samuel Wanyonyi, was a lot like Philip had been in his youth, enthusiastic about his education. In fact, he had moved to Nairobi to live with his aunt because he was attending a prestigious school in the region. But after only 3 months, Samuel went missing. He was gone for only 3 days before a note was left on the doorstep of his aunt's home. The note demanded 40,000 Kenya shillings to be sent to a phone number through M-Pesa, a money transfer application. The family of Samuel Wanyonyi refused to pay the ransom because they simply didn't have it. That was when a second letter arrived at their Nairobi home, along with some items of Samuel's clothing, which he had been wearing when he went missing. This time, the price had been reduced to 10,000 Kenya shillings. Still though, the family couldn't or wouldn't pay it. After this, the letters stopped arriving. So did the harassing phone calls, which had been tormenting the family into paying a ransom for a family member they believed was already dead. All the while, a local man named Philip Onyancha had been helping out with the neighborhood searches for Samuel, offering to help with large mobs of volunteers looking for the boy. He even told the family of the victim that the handwriting on their handwritten letters looked like that of a female, which we know now was an attempt to remove himself from suspicion. In 2010, the city of Thika, which sits about an hour north of Nairobi, experienced a significant uptick in violent deaths. In particular, 86 workers were killed over the span of the year, but a couple of high-profile deaths early on put this industrial city on high alert. In January of 2010, the body of a sex worker named Helen Nyambura was found in a room at Ruambogo Bar and Restaurant. Her body had been left there for several days. It would later be learned that the killer stopped by to view her body close to a dozen times before it was finally discovered. Even then, the killer waited in a gathering crowd to watch the police extract it from the room it had been lying in. Police originally stated that they believed she had died of epileptic shock before learning the shocking truths months later. Then, just about a week later, a similar crime happened in a separate area of Thika. On February 2nd, 2010, 25-year-old Jacqueline Wamboi met up with a client before heading to the Suitable Lodging House, a low-scale motel mostly known for sex work. There, she also met her unfortunate fate, and her body was found the next day, naked and with her neck broken. Throughout all 8 of these murders, police struggled to identify any leads. They were able to trace back the victims to particular places and times, but because of the seemingly random nature of the crimes, there was little for detectives to do. They remained unsolved for the foreseeable future. Investigation and capture. In April of 2010, a 9-year-old boy named Anthony Muerero went missing from his family's neighborhood of Dagoretti, a western suburb of Nairobi. Following his disappearance, weeks passed with no word. But then, just like the prior kidnapping victims, a note arrived at the home of his family. The note demanded an amount to be paid in ransom for the safe return of 9-year-old Anthony. Unlike the prior victims, the family of Anthony were actually able to pay and followed the instructions we told them to send the money through M-Pesa and provided a mobile phone number to send the money to. Unbeknownst to the kidnapper, however, the money was being tracked through the program by the police. It wasn't until the first week of June 2010, nearly 2 months after Anthony's disappearance, that his family would learn he was already dead. His body was found heavily decomposed, meaning that he had been killed just a short time after going missing. However, they finally had an answer and knew what had happened to their young son. That was because police had the culprit in custody, a 32-year-old man named Philip Onyancha, who, within a day, had confessed to killing nearly 20 people. On June 5th, Philip Onyancha was arrested by police after multiple pieces of evidence put him in their sights for a recent abduction. Using Safaricom call data records, investigators were able to track the money being paid to the alleged kidnapper of the 9-year-old boy. When they found the suspect, they were then able to determine that a handwritten ransom note left at the scene of the abduction was written by Onyancha himself. Following his arrest, Onyancha confessed to killing nearly 20 people. This number varies based on the publication, but it has consistently been reported as being at least 17, with the most recent speculation settling around 19 victims, all of which were women and children, whom Philip described as being weak and vulnerable to his attacks. In Onyancha's confession, Onyancha described how his crimes had escalated over the years, originating from his time in high school. He claimed that in his first year at Kenyatta Mahiga High School, a female teacher had recruited him into a murderous cult. Once initiated into the cult, he was responsible for killing 100 people, at which point he would be blessed with an untold amount of riches. As part of the cult's practices, however, he said he had engaged in practices deemed barbaric and audacious. After killing each of his victims, he described drinking blood from their bodies, usually from their necks. Despite claiming to have never met other members of the cult, Onyancha claimed to have had some accomplices to the kidnappings he perpetrated. These two men, Tobias Aradi and Douglas Obiero, were arrested shortly after Onyancha's confession for having involvement in a kidnapping ring that would help Onyancha kidnap victims and hold them for ransom. Oftentimes, they would be held for weeks or even months before ransom notes would be sent out, and every single time when the notes were sent out, they were already dead at the hands of Philip himself. Richard Katola, the head of Special Crimes Prevention Unit, told the media about these two accomplices. "We are interrogating them, and from what we have established, they were accomplices of this man. They will definitely stand trial with him." Despite having two potential accomplices arrested, accused of organizing a kidnapping with Onyancha, investigators were eager to get to the bottom of the cult allegations made by Philip. If it was true there are others like him trying to murder 100 victims, it would be making their jobs much harder in the near future. However, Philip claims to have never met any other cult members. This meant that the police needed to find the woman that Philip alleged had initiated him into the cult, a teacher from his days back in high school. Impact on communities. Of the people shocked by the news, none was hit harder than Lydia Onyancha, Philip's wife. She had been married to the man for several years, and the two had a young son who was just 2.5 years old at the time of his arrest. Lydia later told a reporter that she knew something was wrong when the police visited their home and picked up Onyancha for an interview. She originally thought it was a work-related matter, but was kept in the dark until the very next day when she saw the news. "I was in the house the day he was arrested, but I was shocked when I learned the next day the crime he had committed." While reading the newspaper, Lydia discovered that her husband, Philip Onyancha, was a serial killer. She claims that as soon as she saw this, she passed out. As the news began to spread, Lydia was forced to leave her home along with her 2-year-old son for fear of retribution by victims' families. She left for her family village just hours before an angry mob stormed into the Onyancha home and threatened to burn it down. It would later be noted that this mob was only deterred by police, who intervened just in time. However, Lydia would not return to the home, instead choosing to remain behind in her family's village over in Western Kenya. There, she had to mourn not only for the lives she and her son had lost, but the lives lost in Philip's wake. "I feel sadder for the families of the victims. I keep praying to God to console them, and I apologize on his behalf to all of them." Over the next several days, word of Philip Onyancha's actions spread throughout, not only the region of Nairobi, Kenya's largest city, but throughout all of Kenya. Within a few days, he had become the nation's most infamous and most feared killer. Publications describing him as having the eyes of a fox, and his soft-spoken, casual demeanor often drew comparisons to Ted Bundy. It was also noted that he had a large, orange-sized tumor on the back of his head, something that led to several theories about his mental health and behavioral issues. Following the news of his arrest, Philip led investigators on a tour of his crime scenes where he claimed to recall each crime as if it just happened. In some of the cases, the bodies of his victims had been found and were either unidentified or their cases had simply been left unsolved. Philip's testimony was enough to bring those cases back to the limelight and give them some sense of resolution. This trip took Philip out from Nairobi to the Central Province and Rift Valley, where Philip described killing victims and leaving their bodies in isolated, undisturbed areas. This even included some cheap lodges and motels where Philip admitted to killing several sex workers. As you can guess, the reaction from the public was less than ideal. Angry mobs followed around the police cruisers and gathered around each crime scene, waiting for Onyancha to show himself. In some cases, furious onlookers even brandished weapons or nooses, threatening vengeance. In those first few days, at least 4 bodies were found. These were victims that had gone missing in the preceding few years and whose families had received no word of their whereabouts since. This included 2 bodies found in Karen, a western suburb of Nairobi. Onyancha led police to a home where he had worked as a security guard. In an attic, police found the bones of a deceased young woman who Philip claimed he had picked up at random while working. He had simply seen this woman on the street and her life was ended. Philip then led police to the Nairobi Water and Sewage Company office building at nearby Karen Shopping Center, where the body of another young woman was found in exposed sewer drains. This would later be determined to be the remains of Catherine Chelangat, the 32-year-old mother of one. She had been missing for 2 years at this point. In addition to finding the bodies of victims, Philip also gave investigators some resolution for unsolved cases. This included the unresolved deaths of Helen Nyambura and Jacqueline Wamboi, 2 sex workers from Thika, whose bodies had been found just months prior, inside cheap motel rooms. Philip led investigators to the cramped, dirty rooms where both ladies had been found and claimed responsibility for their murders. Lessons learned. Despite providing investigators with many answers regarding unsolved murders and kidnappings, there were many throughout Kenya that still had tons of questions. They wanted to learn what had driven this once promising young man to become the nation's most infamous serial killer, and if there was anything they could do to prevent it elsewhere. Also, journalists were eager to know more about this cult that Philip Onyancha claimed to have involvement in, claims that seemed to fall on deaf ears. On what had encouraged him to start killing, Onyancha told local reporters, including those with the Kenya Daily Nation newspaper, that he felt a powerful and unstoppable urge to kill. He said he derived pleasure from strangling victims and drinking their blood. Their blood, he said, fueled him and gave him supernatural abilities that allowed him to subdue victims much more easily in the future. When asked why he had targeted mostly female victims in addition to children, Philip stated, "When the urge comes, they are the easiest victims. When I've met my target, even if she tries to resist, she can't. I only need to greet her, shake her hand, and then she becomes confused, kind of. One time in Nairobi, I managed to make a lady follow me only by talking to her, but because I did not greet her, she survived. I always went for the weak in society. You know, women and children are always weak and vulnerable, which makes them an easy target." Despite claiming responsibility for the killings, Philip almost tried to shirk responsibility by claiming that it wasn't him who had directed the killings. Again, he said, he had been initiated into a cult that forced him to do these evil things. "My target was to kill 100 women. I managed 17 and there were 83 to go. After agreeing to join the cult, I graduated automatically. From then on, spirits would send me to go and kill. In the cult, it was like a stage, and to go to the next level, I had to kill a lot of people and also meet the leader of the cult. I feel relieved. I am happy to have confessed all of this. It was troubling. It was not my wish to do these evils. I know it's a crime to kill and it's against the 10 commandments of God, but you see, I was not myself. I regret a lot. I share the pain with the grieving families, but then it was not my fault. It was the spirits in me. I have not repeated what I have been doing because my initiators warned me that if I ever reveal it to anyone or confess, I lose the spirits and the power. I am now back to my senses. Conclusion: the case against Philip Onyancha remains an open-ended affair, but this story has taught me that occasionally the gears of a judicial system can move slowly, and none move slower than in Kenya, where this 8-year-old investigation and prosecution now has to basically start over from scratch. As such, it is unlikely to reach a resolution anytime soon due to the various moving components and the multiple jurisdictions where the crimes took place. Philip Onyancha and his alleged accomplices, Tobias Aradi and Douglas Obiero, are still awaiting trial. The prosecution had built a pretty convincing case for at least 3 murders, but you can only guess on whether or not the number will change in the coming months and years. To this day, Philip Onyancha remains feared among the Kenyan people, becoming known as the nation's most infamous serial killer. In fact, he is credited by some reports as being the first serial killer to rock the nation, but it is unlikely that he will be the last. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the Philip Onyancha case. Remember, it's important to approach true crime content with empathy and consideration for the victims and their families. Stay informed, stay safe, and until next time, take care.